We're going to start by going back to some events that happened last night that then lead into what happened today. All night long, Jesus stood before the council, listening to the false charges they had made. None of the witnesses they called told the same story. They could prove nothing against Jesus. At last, in desperation, the high priest challenged Jesus directly. "Tell me on oath," he demanded, "are you the Messiah, the Son of God?" "I am," Jesus replied. "That settles the matter," the high priest declared. "The prisoner has claimed to be divine. He deserves, by our law, to die." But only Pilate, the Roman governor, could pass the death sentence. They must convince him that Jesus had committed crimes worthy of death by Roman reckoning. They handed Jesus over to the guards, who tormented and ill-treated him, while they made their plans. Early in the morning, they took Jesus in chains to Pilate's palace. Pilate was in Jerusalem to keep order during the excitable days of Passover. "This man has been stirring up trouble," they told Pilate. "He tells people not to pay taxes, and he says he's a king." If these charges were true, Jesus would be sentenced to death. But Pilate was certain that the religious leaders had trumped up the charges because they were jealous of him. He began to cross-question Jesus himself, and could find nothing wrong that he had done. All the while, a mob below in the street, mustered and led by the priests and leaders, were chanting over and over, "Crucify! Crucify! Crucify!" Pilate came out to speak to them. "This man is completely innocent," he announced. "He doesn't deserve to die." The chant swelled to a deafening roar, "Crucify! Crucify!" Pilate tried another way out. "It's Passover time," he said. "I shall set a prisoner free as part of the celebrations. Let me set Jesus free." But the leaders were ready with a new slogan. "We want Barabbas! We want Barabbas!" And the crowd took up the cry. Barabbas was a mob leader in prison for murder. Pilate was at his wit's end. If the crowd rioted, he might lose his job. He dare not release Jesus, even though Roman justice declared him innocent. He decided to wash his hands of the whole matter and hand Jesus over to be put to death by crucifixion, as the mob insisted. Pilate ordered his mercenaries to whip Jesus before taking him to be crucified. Roman whips were made from leather strips, weighted with pieces of metal, and prisoners sometimes died from the injuries they caused. After they'd whipped Jesus, the Roman soldiers teased him cruelly. Was he supposed to be a king? They dressed him up in a robe dyed royal purple, and one of them quickly put together an imitation crown from sharp speared thorn twigs and rammed it down on his head. Then they knelt to him, mocking him, proclaiming, "Long live the king," before spitting in his face. Soon it was time to take the prisoner to the place of execution. By Jewish law, this had to be outside the city gates. The little procession set off down the hill towards Golgotha, which means skull place. A mocking, shouting crowd followed with a few women, and a few women went too, crying to see the good, brave teacher being led off to die. Prisoners were expected to carry the rough wooden crossbar on which they were to be executed, and the soldiers had already laid the heavy beam on Jesus' shoulders. But Jesus was weak from the long interrogations and the whipping. He could scarcely walk upright beneath its weight. An African Jew, up from Passover, came striding up the hill towards them. "Hey, you," the centurion called, laying a firm hand on his arm. "Carry the cross for the prisoner. We'll never get there at the rate we're going." Simon was strong and broad-shouldered. He carefully lifted the cross from Jesus' torn shoulders and hoisted it onto his own. Together, they walked the rest of the rough road to Golgotha. The Romans crucified troublesome slaves and desperate criminals. Roman citizens were spared such a cruel death. Large nails were driven through the victims' feet and outstretched hands in order to fix them to the crossbeams of wood. The cross was set in a socket in the ground and then lifted up, so the criminal was suspended, left to die from heat and thirst. There were 3 prisoners to be crucified that day, and the execution squad set to work. By 9 o'clock, the 3 crosses were lifted into position. Jesus was on the centre one. Then the soldiers settled down to wait, gambling with dice to while away the time. Jesus looked down at them with pity. "Forgive them, Father," he said. "They don't know what they're doing." The religious leaders had arrived to gloat and jeer. "You saved others," they said mockingly, "but you can't save yourself." One of the criminals hanging on the next cross muttered hoarsely, "Aren't you supposed to be the Messiah? Why don't you save us all then?" But the other criminal said, "You be quiet. We deserve to die, but this man is innocent." Then he begged Jesus, "When you come as king, please remember me." "You don't have to wait until then," Jesus replied. "You will be with me in paradise this very day." Some of Jesus' disciples, mostly the women, were there too. "Look after my mother," Jesus whispered to his close friend John. John nodded. "He'll be a son to you now," Jesus told his mother, who stood crying bitterly. At noon, when the sun should have been brightest, thick darkness fell. For 3 hours Jesus suffered all alone, carrying the weight of the whole world's sin. Then, at 3 o'clock, he called in a clear, triumphant voice, "Finished!" Then he gave up his life and died. Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy citizen, asked Pilate's permission to give Jesus a proper burial. Nicodemus, who had visited Jesus at night, came to help him. The 2 men gently washed the body, wrapped it in clean grave clothes, and laid it on a stone ledge in the cave tomb in Joseph's garden. Some of the women who had been at Golgotha followed to see where Jesus was being buried. Then, worn out with sadness and crying, they went away. So I'm putting into my garden a cross that I've made. To remind me that Jesus died.